Well, 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 look who it is. Welcome back to Killer Bites, you true crime junkie. This show isn't like most shows. No, it's super cool. We talk about true crime cases in the kitchen. Sometimes we cook, sometimes we don't. Today I'm going to be telling you all about the Eastburn family murders. In this case, the killer almost got away with it. Only a few things get me more pumped up than an unsolved case being solved. Well, what if I told you that a murder of an entire family carried out by a sergeant in the army had gone cold for over 20 years before it was solved? What is done in the dark will always come to light. So for any horrible murderers out there that haven't been caught yet, we're gonna get you. Let's start at the very beginning. This story starts off with a little bit of love. Love at first sight, the best kind. Gary and Katie Eastburn met each other in the early 1970s. Katie grew up in Kansas and met Gary at a softball game. In an instant, the spark started to fly. When you know, you know. Gary and Katie didn't jump into anything too quickly though. They dated for 5 years until they were sure they were ready to get married. We love a couple that thinks through important decisions. Good for you. And in 1975, they finally tied the knot. They went on to have 3 children together. Kara, who was 5 years old, Aaron, who was 3, and Jana, who was almost 2. Gary was sent to Fayetteville to work as the chief of air traffic control, and the family would be there for as long as his job needed him. Gary was a military man and ranked as a captain in the U.S. Air Force. Katie was a stay-at-home mom, and this lifestyle seemed to work for them. They loved their kids, loved their marriage, and it just seemed like a really wholesome household to grow up in. The Eastburns would remain in Fayetteville for about 2 more years and would enjoy their stay. Everyone in the community just adored them and was happy to have them there, even if it wasn't permanent. But Gary received a job from the Royal Air Force in England, which meant they would be moving again. Not a strange thing for military families to do. Next stop, England. Choo-choo. Get your wellies on, cause it's time to start drinking tea and eating scones with the Queen. Pip pip cheerio. Okay, I'll stop now. It wasn't uncommon for the girls to go without seeing their dad for long periods. Even though their home base was Fayetteville, Gary was stationed 500 miles away in Montgomery, Alabama for officer training. But the family stayed in contact. Every Saturday, Gary would call Katie and the girls to say hi, check in, yada yada. It was their own little tradition. Very sweet. And this is a house with little children. It's common for them to be outside, playing, making noise, kid stuff. But the next door neighbors noticed that the family hadn't been out and about in a few days, which was super uncommon for the family. Side note, did anyone else get a deep sense of emptiness when their friends were absent from school? You're telling me I have to sit through algebra class alone? That's like my version of hell. All that to say, you are aware when people aren't there, especially people you're close to. The neighbors noticed that the daily newspaper had started piling up on the front porch. These were the types of people who left their house at least once a day, even if it was just to be in the front yard. They never left days' worth of newspapers to sit outside. One of the neighbors knocked on the door. No one answered, but he did hear a baby crying. He called over his wife to see if she heard the same thing, and sure enough, she did. They assumed it was the youngest child, Jana. So with the newspapers, no one answering the door, and the child crying in the back, they knew something weird was going on. They called the police and arrived about 15 minutes after the phone call. But when the cops showed up on the scene, they couldn't hear a baby crying. So as cops are known to do, they jumped to conclusions and assumed that the neighbors were confused and hearing things. The neighbors also called the Eastburns' babysitter, Julie, because they couldn't get a hold of the family. This seemed like the best person to get in contact with while they waited for the police. Well, while the police are over here thinking there's no baby crying, Julie straight up looks in the window and sees that it's baby Jana. She's like, yo, that's the kid. Why are we wasting time? If a baby screams for that long and no one comes to soothe her, someone needs to get in there and help that baby. Once the officers got the visual confirmation from Julie, they went into the house. Jana was crying, pale, and just did not look okay. She looked sickly and scared. They took her out of the house because it was apparent she hadn't eaten anything in a very long time and her diaper hadn't been changed in days. The neighbors took Jayna to their house next door and gave her milk. And this girl started sucking down this milk as if her life depended on it. Because it did. She was severely dehydrated and even threw up because she couldn't keep up with the rate at which she was drinking. Sadly, Jayna would be the only survivor found in the Eastburns' house. She was taken to the hospital, and thank God they rescued her when they did. She would have lost her life had she stayed in the house alone for another hour. While Jayna was being nursed back to health, the bodies of her 2 sisters and her mother would be found in the most horrific state imaginable. In the parents' bedroom, 32-year-old Katie was found on the floor next to her bed. She had an incredibly deep slash to her neck and 15 lacerations on her chest. Her undergarments and bottoms had been cut off of her body, and there were signs of forced relations. On the other side of the bed was 3-year-old Erin. She was found with a pillow covering her face and slash on her neck. It cut so deep that her head was almost detached from her body. Lastly, 5-year-old Kara was found in her own bedroom, hiding underneath her Star Wars blanket. She had multiple lacerations to the chest. So all 3 victims had been found with their throats slashed. I know that these cases can be really gruesome, so if you need to take some time to regroup, I completely understand. It's hard for me to wrap my head around how someone could do something this awful, but then to add innocent children to the mix, it's vile. Gary was contacted by the police shortly after his family's bodies were discovered. He wasn't given any more info other than there had been a passing in the family and he needed to come home ASAP. I can't even imagine getting that call. You're hundreds of miles away from work, getting ready to make a huge move with your family, and this happens? I don't think I could move. I would just be in total shock. The second Gary answered the phone, he knew something wasn't right. He had been trying to reach Katie for days with no response, so he expected the worst. They had a set schedule for when they would call each other. They would send letters all the time. She never missed a phone call. But the cops wouldn't tell him who the victim was or how many there were for that matter. So he hopped on a plane for Fayetteville and headed to the police station. Investigators got to work immediately. And while this is a horrifying tragedy, humans do be nosy, and everyone wanted to know what happened. Once they were told it was the Eastburns, you could feel the mood shift instantly. Detectives talked to Julie, the babysitter, and she told them that Katie was sure she had a stalker. She had been receiving prank calls for months before the murders. Yeah, you heard that right, months. Whoever was calling would just say really gross, creepy stuff. A lot of the time they would bring up inappropriate situations involving Katie. No one knew who this person was though. As the house was searched, investigators noted that all of the window and door latches were unlocked, and the bulk of the struggle happened in the living room. Officials were doing luminol tests all throughout the house, the walls, the floor, everywhere. And well, wouldn't you know it? It was evident that someone tried to clean up a mess. There was still a lot of blood at the crime scene, but not nearly as much as there should have been, considering the degree of violence and how many victims there were. But whoever committed this crime didn't do an excellent job of hiding their tracks. It was done in such a sloppy way. For example, there were red fingerprints all over the place, as well as fluid-soaked towels, possibly to clean up the crime scene. Shoe tracks were found inside and outside of the home, and DNA evidence was discovered inside of Katie's body. But what the heck was the motive? What could be the reason for 2 children to be brutally murdered in their own home? Gary was taken to the crime scene to see if anything had been stolen. An envelope with some cash, Katie's ATM card, and PIN number had been taken. But that was it. That's it? All this tragedy for some cash and an ATM card? It doesn't seem worth it. There had to be something else. So remember Jayna, the 2-year-old who almost lost her life from dehydration? Well, that little girl started going to a child psychologist to work through the trauma of that terrible experience. She told her doctor that her house was scary. She needed to hide and be quiet so that the bad man wouldn't get her. This led the psychologist to believe that Jana's sisters, Kara and Erin, had come into her room to warn her. They likely told her to stay quiet and hide so she wouldn't get hurt. This is why Jana survived, and her sisters did not. They protected her, even in their final moments. And you might be thinking, Jana was the only survivor and she didn't even see the person who did it. How are they going to catch a runaway killer? Thankfully, a man named Patrick Cohn talked to the police as they were discovering the bodies. He saw a tall, blonde, white man with a mustache wearing a members-only jacket walking away from the Eastburn house at around 3:30 in the morning, 2 days before the family was found. He had on jeans and a knit cap and was seen carrying a trash bag as he left. Here's some good advice for all my morning joggers out there. Don't trust mustache men who carry around trash bags in the wee hours of the morning. He passed Patrick, told him he was getting an early start to his day, and got into his white Chevette. Patrick was a janitor and was leaving his girlfriend's home early that morning, which is why he was awake at the same time as the killer. He had a criminal record, so that made his statement a little less believable. But come on, that's a lot of detail. Down to the members-only jacket? This guy is giving you exactly what you need. They had Patrick sit down with the police sketch artist to work on the picture they eventually released to the public. This made things a lot easier for people to come forward now that they knew what their guy looked like. A woman came forward saying she saw a tall blonde guy with a mustache withdrawing money from an ATM machine 2 days after the incident. Remember that missing ATM card? Ooh, we're gonna get you, buddy. You can't keep hiding for long. Things started to fall into place. We have the car, we have the description of the guy, and Julie, the babysitter, had given investigators a solid lead. Katie had put an ad in the newspaper looking to rehome her dog, Dixie. They were moving to another country and didn't want to put the pup through all of that. Julie received a phone call from a woman named Angela Hennis a couple of days before the tragedy. She was interested in picking up the dog. Julie had taken down Angela's information on a note so Katie could get back to her. But when investigators went to check the house for a note, nothing was found. Oh, and Dixie the dog was nowhere to be found. Well, Angela Hennis realized that they had the Eastburn's dog, and her husband, Tim Hennis, owned a white Chevette. Once they noticed this, Tim drove down to the police station to talk with investigators. However, he told them that he had seen the family on Thursday the 7th, way before the family was found, and picked up the dog Dixie. Tim admitted to calling Katie the morning of the crime to finalize any questions about the dog. But as for the afternoon and evening, Tim Hennis didn't have an alibi. A little backstory on Mr. Tim Hennis. He was a 27-year-old Army sergeant, a husband, and a new father to a little girl. He also looked just like the police sketch put into the media days before. Investigators got all kinds of stuff from good old Tim. Fingerprints, hair samples, blood samples, saliva, the works. Then they sent him on his merry way, knowing full well that they had the main suspect for this crime, and created a lineup for Patrick Cohn to look at. Immediately, Tim's face was chosen out of the bunch. They got to questioning those closest to Tim to learn more about him, his habits, and if anyone noticed him acting super weird lately. And he was acting weird, all right. A few of his neighbors witnessed him burning objects in a barrel outside his home for more than a couple of hours, which, right off the bat, is a sketchy thing to do. They also noted that he had never done that before. A new hobby, perhaps? I think not. Then Tim's landlord came forward to let police know he had been late on rent, but paid the $345 charge just a few days after the murders. What a coincidence! He had just stopped off at the ATM to withdraw some cash. To put the cherry on top, a local dry cleaner told investigators that Tim had come in a couple of days after the tragedy to clean his members-only jacket. All the evidence is really stacked against this guy. You'd think he'd be in jail by now, right? Wrong. Tim Hennis was arrested and charged on 3 counts of first-degree homicide, but refused a plea deal, saying he wasn't going to admit something he didn't do. Right, sure, Jan. But the DNA samples he had given police all came back inconclusive. But it was the 80s, okay? The only thing they had figured out back then was hairspray and TV dinners. Forensic science wasn't at the top of the priorities list, apparently. Almost an entire year after the incident, Tim Hennis went to trial for executing Katie, Kara, and Aaron Eastburn. Annoyingly, none of the evidence could be matched up, but that didn't stop the jury from seeing through this complete disgrace for a human being. Tim Hennis was found guilty and given a fatal sentence. But Tim would try to appeal this. In 1988, they went back to trial on account of the prosecution showed too many graphic images to the jury, and Tim's face had been in the media swaying witnesses. Patrick Cohn was first up to the witness stand, and the defense wanted to poke holes all through his story and credibility, even going as far as to bring a meteorologist to prove the night was too dark and overcast to see anything clearly. Tim's defense team brought up that the DNA found in the home was inconclusive and didn't belong to their client. And the burning barrel thing, it was tested and nothing weird was found. Sadly, the jury would come back with a not guilty verdict, and Tim Hennis would walk away a free man. Tim went on to rejoin the Army, getting back pay from his time in jail, and he received a bunch of medals for serving in Somalia and Saudi Arabia. In 2004, he retired from the Army, settled down, and became his son's Boy Scout leader. But don't worry, the gross excuse for a human won't stay out of jail for long. In 2006, forensic technology had advanced a long way from where it was in the 70s and 80s. DNA evidence from the crime scene and the samples collected from Katie were tested again. It was confirmed that Tim Hennis's DNA matched the samples from Katie's body. At this point, Tim had gone to trial over the slayings, and the prosecution was facing double jeopardy, meaning they couldn't go to court again. But Tim was a military man, and that means there's a loophole. The US Army listed Tim as active duty again so he could go to court again. The courtroom at Fort Bragg was packed to the brim as his defense team tried for a third time to prove his innocence. The prosecution knew this was their time. They had so much on this guy. The only thing the defense hadn't tried was the possibility of an affair. They tried to say Katie was lonely from Gary being away, and when Tim arrived to pick up the dog, that's when they had their affair. Just because someone is lonely doesn't mean they're gonna cheat, okay? What a weak defense. Tim Hennis was found guilty, dishonorably discharged from the Army, and received a fatal sentence. Again. He is the only person to ever be tried 3 times for the same crime and receive both guilty and not guilty verdicts. And now, his ugly face is sitting in prison, where he belongs. I'd like to end on a quote from Gary. "I'm perfectly happy if he spends the rest of his life in jail. However, if they did execute him, it was no more than he deserved." Rest in peace to the beautiful Eastburn girls. You were taken from this world too soon. Well, there you have it, folks. The tragic murders of Katie, Kara, and Aaron Eastburn. Do you think Tim deserves life in prison or the ultimate penalty? I agree with Gary. He can rot for the rest of his life, but it wouldn't be any less than what he deserves if they decide to pull the plug. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.